Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Accounting for California podcast. My name is David Hemphill, the Information and Planning Officer here at the California Board of Accountancy. And once again, I'm very pleased to be joined by Mr. Dominic Franzella, the Executive Officer of the CBA, and Ms. Denise Froemming, the President and CEO of the California Society of Certified Public Accountants.
Great. Glad to be here this morning.
Thanks for joining us, and we're going to talk about Assembly Bill 1175. Now, when we got together last time in late October, all of this was bubbling and getting started. They were proposals, but a lot has happened since then. And we're thankful to say that Assembly Member Jackie Irwin has officially introduced the legislation, which is known as Assembly Bill 1175, and that is to enhance the CPA licensure requirements and modernize mobility. So let's just jump right in. Let's start with you, Dominic. So what is the basic structure of that bill? And I know last time you kind of referred to it as the box that we get started with. So tell us what's in it.
I like the box.
Thanks, David. I think the box does provide a reasonably good metaphor for what we were trying to accomplish. And I think the board, working with CalCPA, did a really fantastic job of creating basically a well-developed set of statutes that allow for flexibility to be seen both at the launch of the new requirements, but as time progresses will provide the needed flexibility to adjust with the changing times. And the bill creates flexible license requirements, as you said, and modernizes mobility. And for those who actually take the time to review the bill text, they'll see some overall basically kind of restructure to various sections to better group concepts together, such as the education and experience requirements, to make it an easier read and an easier follow. And when working to develop that language, we took a very methodical approach. The licensing division staff, especially Michelle Center and her team, did a really good job to create kind of the walls of the box, the four sides, to set the important, what are considered basically the necessary minimum requirements, while providing the CBA that kind of ability to work with stakeholders like CalCPA, with academia, with the profession at large, to implement the more specific requirements through the regulatory process as that time progresses. And again, it'll just allow for that greater flexibility over time. So the box is big enough, but not so big that it's kind of unwieldy.
So what has the reaction been from your membership, Denise, about these proposed changes?
It's been supportive, I would say, throughout our entire process. We had I mentioned last time, a California advisory pipeline group, and that group consisted because we still have these individuals together. It's large firms, small firms, faculty. The CBA was the advisor. So we're hearing positive support throughout the process, from the comment letters to today, also from our board. And I would say too, we're seeing that they're extremely happy to see the mobility and the practice privileges across the states being maintained, and they're being focused on that. Also broadening the pathways. That's been something that's been a conversation for many, many years, honestly. And how do we can open up the profession a bit more to the non-traditional students that are out there? So there's a lot of positivity there and movement. We have had questions regarding lowering the standards. To be honest, that's been out there, ever since we started having conversations. And we keep saying that, we still have that accounting concentration, and the exam is that foundational, bar that everyone has to take. And that does make sure that there's integrity in the content and quality. And there has been the new exam that was released this year that looks at the content from the marketplace and what the need is out there to be successful, and to really come in with that beginning foundational content. So that's there, and that's the conversations that we've been having. I know we had that, Dominic, conversation from when we started having these discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. Right?
Do you have some resources on your website that you want to?
We do. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you, David, for that. And there's also the CBA website, but we do. There's resources on there. There's also a section where you can add your comments. So we've had comments come through customer service that we're addressing. And if you have comments or questions, please put those on our website. Go in and make sure that you provide those, because we want to hear from you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, Dominic, some people are trying to say, is this a new pathway? Are we enhancing a current pathway? Because we'll still have the original legacy pathway. So how do you like to refer to all of this?
Yeah, honestly, I'm kind of moving off this idea of pathway because we didn't establish it in a similar way that maybe other states did, where they continue to keep a 150 semester unit pathway, a bachelor's in 2 pathway. We took a pretty different approach to that concept and really just set a standard, the floor for the requirements, a bachelor's degree with an accounting concentration, the passage of the CPA exam, and then a 2-year general experience requirement. And it's not really looking back to what we had before or looking to what we have now. There's obviously some similarities there, but we look at it as more of having the flexibility within that structure for how somebody may be able to, how an aspiring CPA can meet those requirements. And so let me just provide maybe an example. And I ran this through our licensing team, who's really more knowledgeable about this than I am, just to make sure I was marching down the right path. So an example could be an individual who has an advanced degree, say a master's of public accounting. And even more, let's just say that individual earned that degree from a recognized, that the degree is recognized by the CBA, which this legislation will allow the CBA to do, this kind of expressway mentality for the accounting concentration. And in doing so, by completing that degree from the degree is recognized by the CBA, this aspiring CPA will have met the degree requirement, obviously, will have met the accounting concentration requirement by virtue of that recognized degree, and will be able to substitute 1 year of general accounting experience. So it looks similar to what the legacy pathway will continue to offer, but is really built under this idea of here's a foundation, here are these set requirements, and there may be just certain ways that people can meet certain things along the way that creates that flexibility through the type of degree, the expressway, the substituting a year of experience. So I don't look at it as having multiple pathways. It's one set of requirements with hopefully a significant amount of flexibility, but it's still simple to understand, because if you get too many pathways or you get too much flexibility, it becomes very difficult to kind of follow a map. So we're trying to be very cautious of that as well.
So go ahead.
I was just going to say, to me, that's really future-proofing what we're doing here, right? In order to have that flexibility to add in or flex as new programs or certificates come into place, you're being proactive and allowing for that, rather than having multiple different pathways, right?
No, I agree.
Because it's hard to forecast. Let's just say that. It's really hard these days.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Yeah, it really is. I kind of wanted to go down that path a little further, though. Oh, sorry, path. I don't want to say pathway. But because we're using both legislation and regulation to accomplish these. And I know there's probably a lot of people out there who don't really understand what the difference is between those. So maybe explain why it's beneficial to use a combination of both, and maybe just sprinkle in a little bit of what they each mean.
Yeah, sure. Again, I'm going to get hit over the head with it a lot, but the box metaphor, when you're looking at legislation, it's a perfectly good tool to provide both a high level or a very specific set about very specific requirements. It can do both. But if you use solely legislation to do that and create a very specific approach within the legislation, it'll require a legislative solution every time there's really depending on the level of change, even a minor change could require us to go back to the legislature to update or modify those requirements. But conversely, the legislation can also just create a structure and defines how an agency such as our board could basically further define what's inside of that structure and provides a more evergreen approach. So to your question, to the second part of your question, the legislation part of it requires the legislature finding an author, doing everything we're doing right now to implement a change, whereas a regulation, as long as the legislation or the statutes provide the framework to do it, you can, as the agency, in this case the board, go through what's called a rulemaking process and work with stakeholders to make substantive changes to your requirements. And that's kind of the approach that we worked with or Assemblymember Irwin's office on when she introduced AB 1175. And the bill creates the structure and gives guidance to the board on how to kind of fill that structure. And that the rulemaking process is what we'll be doing and create the actual substance of those requirements.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point so the legislation has been introduced, but now what may be included in the regulations is going to be discussed and eventually drafted in the upcoming months in preparation for the rulemaking process, which will begin once the bill becomes law. I wanted to take a moment here, though, to make sure everyone understands that the conversations being had now are policy discussions and direction for what could be included when the actual regulatory or rulemaking process will begin later this year. That process does allow a time window for public comment. Leading up to that, the CBA has already begun discussing, started in January, potential subject areas and unit requirements for the accounting concentration part of the regulations. This was presented after gathering feedback from stakeholders, and Dominic, I'll have you talk about this a little more in a second, but the CBA gave direction to draft regulations which would require 24 units in accounting subjects, 24 units in business-related subjects, and 3 units in accounting or business ethics to make up the accounting concentration, called for as part of the bachelor's degree requirement. Coming up in May and July at those CBA meetings, the CBA will be presented with the results of more stakeholder feedback regarding which accounting-related degrees and certificates should be allowed to substitute for general accounting experience, and a process and criteria for recognizing specific accounting degrees for the transcript review expressway. Now, like I mentioned, these board meetings are great opportunities for stakeholders to give their input. Remember, the CBA wants to hear from you. Whether you agree with the recommendation or not, it is important that you take this opportunity for involvement in the future of your profession. We anticipate the final draft regulations to be brought to the CBA for action in September, so the rulemaking process can begin when the bill becomes law, right around shortly after that, probably. Remember, it is these regulations that are the official vehicle for filling the box, like Dominic likes to refer to. So, Denise, we have a better idea now what it's going to be if it becomes law. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us what those timeframes are?
Sure. The dates are for the automatic mobility would be January 1st, 2026. And then for the pathway, that would be July 1st, 2026. And then the legacy pathways, right, would be in place until January 1, 2028. I'm looking at Dominic.
2029.
The end of 2028.
That's it. The end of 2028. Thank you for that.
Yep.
A lot of dates there.
Yeah.
But again, the dates, this information is on the website. So it will be in front of you all the time. And we'll be trying to keep up to date on resources.
Yeah, we have a full timeline right now on the CBA website there's a lot going on that timeline. So right now we're kind of in the legislative process. And if things go according to plan, then the bill will be passed to the governor's desk, hopefully at some point in September, and he'll have 30 days to sign. So this year, hopefully for the passage of the bill, and then, as Denise said, January 1st, 2026, it would officially kick in.
Yes.
At least the mobility part. Then there's kind of a 6-month implementation window that we're looking at before we jump in, which just gives us more time to do more podcasts, right?
Absolutely.
And spread the word a little more and just make sure everyone is ready and on the same page about these potential still upcoming changes.
Because there'll be a lot of questions, to your point. I mean, it's complex, as you heard from Dominic, it is. And so we have FAQs, you have FAQs on your site, you have different recordings as well. I would encourage all of you, I hate to keep telling you about the websites, but to go on there, get the information because it's there. Mm-hmm. And there are FAQs, and as we have questions coming in, we will also provide answers and responses to those questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we even have a webpage that we put up last week you can even go in, there's even timestamps to all of the discussions leading up to this point at the last 2 years of CBA meetings. So you can really go down the rabbit hole if you'd like.
I started. I mean, I couldn't believe there were the timestamps on there. I was like, this is
we
fabulous.
Try to help. We're not going to make you sit through an entire 4-hour video.
Fabulous.
Come
yes.
on, we're here. We're here to help you. So that's as far as the legislation. Mm-hmm. Now looking at the regulations that are getting started, can you kind of walk us through what we potentially have lined up for the year? What's kind of the time frame for those?
Yeah, so as soon as, even before the bill was introduced, back in January, we actually launched into this process of looking at the bill language and determining what areas of the bill would likely or would be required to have regulations in order to implement the provisions, especially with the aggressive timeline of July 1, 2026 for the licensure requirements. And so back in January, the board started looking at the accounting concentration, what that would mean, and that's kind of the foundational piece that takes us to the next steps of looking at recognized degrees or substituting a year of experience for an advanced degree, or maybe some amount of time for a certificate or training program as those come online. So I would anticipate, while we don't have anything for our meeting later this month on this particular topic, in May and in July, probably again in September, there'll be this ongoing discussion of refining those regulations. So as individuals have questions or they want to be more actively involved in the development or the process of it, those are their opportunities through our board meetings to kind of affect change or get their information before the board so people can understand, or so the members can understand how to craft those regulations appropriately.
A lot of opportunities for feedback.
Yeah.
So the 150 unit requirement, which is current, part of the current pathway, is essentially going away. So there is that element about that potential fifth year of education now kind of being replaced with an additional year of experience. How do you see that affecting the students and ultimately the pool of candidates that will be looking to achieve their license?
Well, I mean, there's a key barrier, right, that we have that we're eliminating. And so that's a positive. And I know a number of the students have said, oh, that makes it just so much more achievable for me. Especially it opens the door up for non-traditional students. And we're seeing more and more students that are second career individuals that said, oh, the career that I thought I wanted, it really doesn't make sense for me. I want something that's different and that's definitely more stable. And accounting is one of those careers. So we're seeing more and more second career. And that definitely, when they're working, this allows an opportunity for them to come in. I would say, too, from a competitive standpoint, you don't have those students that are saying, oh, I want to opt out because data analytics is 4 years and now I have this fifth year, right? So it allows I think the playing field to be a little bit more level. I know there's a study out there, and there's a lot of studies, right? But there's one by MIT that said when the 150 was brought in, there was a 14% decrease, right, in those students that were coming in. And, if it's 10, 14, whatever, it still meant that there was a barrier that was created. And so we're seeing that being eliminated. Now, I will say, we've said this many times, it's not a silver bullet. There's other barriers we have, whether it's balancing personal life and professional salaries, what it may be, it's still, those are there. So we have to work on those, and we are working on those, and awareness and what a CPA really does. But this starts just eliminates that initial barrier that's there and allows there to be other conversations about other things that we need to work on. So I'm seeing a lot of positives. And I will say too, just there being a system that's more understandable. We're not changing the rigor. We're just making sure that you can understand it and it not be so convoluted that you say, I'm out from the beginning. Right. So definitely there's a positive there.
Right. I like that, the kind of the leveling the playing field. Right. No, that's important. Let's discuss the mobility portion of this a little bit, which we haven't gotten into yet. So moving towards now a more open mobility program. So in November at the meeting, the CBA discussed removing the term substantial equivalency in how California will look at other states to determine if their CPAs can practice without notice here in California. So tell us about that shift, and then how will the CBA continue protecting California consumers moving forward if it passes?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term substantial equivalency kind of got embedded in both the mobility practice privilege provisions that exist, but it also kind of integrates itself into our licensure requirements and is a national kind of term to evaluate states across lines for their licensure requirements. But the equivalency was really based off of 150 semester units, the exam, and the 1 year experience requirement, but really that the idea of substantial was lost a little bit in that discussion of how that should be equated out. So our board took a shift and is now using a term here called comparable licensure model, where it's now kind of looking at, do you have a degree as a requirement for education, not specific units, how many units make up those pieces, understanding that that might be something that the state has an interest in, another state has an interest in that we may not, but is there a degree that you're requiring and has some type of an accounting concentration? Do you require the passage of the exam, and do you have an experience requirement? And so comparable licensure model is going to be more the common term, but as it's practically used for mobility purposes in terms of safeguarding consumers, really nothing changed. All it did was no longer apply that term for how you enter the state and rely on CPA equals CPA for purposes of entering and practicing, but for the board to maintain this level of authority to manage its consumer protection requirements by saying, okay, well, if I look at state A, B, or C, and they've now dropped it below one of this, like they no longer require a bachelor's degree, the board has an ability to react and remove those automatic CPA equals CPA rights to individuals coming from those states. So functionally, I don't think it really changes much. We still have all these California's significant guardrails and ability to affect change to make sure that consumers here are protected. It's just redefining, providing a better definition and a more manageable definition of how to evaluate another state rather than using substantial equivalency and leaning into maybe a national model of it is saying comparable and letting the Board of Accountancy define what that meant for purposes of coming in and out of the state.
It's still right on the onus of the individual and the firms, right, to know the regulations when they come in and to make sure they understand, right? So, I mean, that's all the same, as you said.
So what would happen to an individual from said bad state if that ever happens? Are they completely excluded from California, or do they have an individual way in?
Correct. No, they aren't. The idea is not to stop qualified individuals from coming in. The simplicity of CPA equals CPA from state, looking at a state just creates a level of simplicity that I can just say state A can come. But if we were ever to say state A licensure requirements and it could potentially pose a risk of consumer protection, then it does. It shifts to the individual and there's a notification requirement. It's no longer under this no notice requirement. It moves to a notification requirement. But it doesn't interrupt that CPA's ability to service the clients here and those clients to continue to rely on that individual. And as Denise said, the onus still lands on that CPA or that firm to understand that that requirement may exist if that state was kind of removed from the CPA equals CPA model. Provide the notification. Right now, it doesn't have a fee with it. It's something simple to do. It's I think it's a 1 or 2 pages just to provide some general information and how you qualify, and you're right back into kind of practicing. It's just taking that one no notice piece away if that were ever get there. And let's just hope it doesn't kind of get to that point, but we do have a mechanism and a backstop for both the CPA and the client to make sure that it doesn't interrupt them too much.
I thought in closing we could just kind of discuss maybe the national wins and what's going on, because California is certainly not going out there, on our own. Everything we've done up to this point has been very collaborative, that we kind of discussed in the first podcast. But what have you noticed? I'll pose this to both of you. I'll start with you, Denise. What have you noticed nationally about the progress from other states and pursuing things similar to this?
As you said, there's been a lot of collaboration. We didn't get to this point without talking, collaborating, having common tenets that we're focused on. That's all been in the works for the last year. There's a number of states, and Dominic can speak to that more in detail, but there's many states, over 30, that are headed down this path, down a very, very similar path, and keeping it at the same time frame too, right? So we've all kind of worked together, a lot of respect there, and trust to work together. So it's been phenomenal as far as the conversations that we've been able to have. But without having that trust and the opportunity to work together before, this probably wouldn't have happened. But it's really come together quickly, I would say, more quickly than I thought initially.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, what we're seeing nationally is we definitely weren't the first, and we're not going to be the last to have introduced legislation this year. And in some states, it's already passed. They're kind of maybe multiple pathway and open mobility, or some states are only going after mobility and leaving their licensure requirements intact, but they're trying to be reactive and proactive in some instances to make sure mobility is not interrupted too much, and that cross-border practice can continue. But like I said, I think I know of 2 states who have already passed their legislations. One has been signed in, one is awaiting a governor's signature, and we'll probably know here in this month and maybe even by May for a couple of other states who have a much quicker legislative process where they stand. So I fully anticipate you're going to see a rush this year and again next year for those legislatures who meet every other year and they're not in their legislative year to be doing something next year. Because some states have an opportunity to wait and see how the lay of the land kind of falls. But everybody, from what I've seen, is either moving down a more redefined open mobility or automatic mobility kind of model, and either doing that by itself or combining that with licensure requirements that are similar, comparable, as you were, to what we've done, whether or not they're creating 3 pathways, 2 pathways, doing something similar to what we are doing here. It's kind of all over the place, but everybody feels comfortable in the direction it's kind of going, I think, because it's setting the bar at basically a BA, county concentration, passage of the exam, and 2 years experience across the states that have been introducing things.
Yeah.
All right. Well, these are certainly exciting times for the profession, and especially for those that are soon to be entering the profession. And we promise we'll do our best to continue coming together and having these conversations as these changes are made. These are major changes, and we're going to do our best to make sure they're communicated as best as possible to everyone. So with that, I encourage you to follow us on our social media if you don't already, LinkedIn, X, Facebook, and even Instagram. So you can find us CBA News, do that. And then, of course, CalCPA as well. They'll get out some great information for their members. And, so as this is changing, going through this year, getting hopefully approved, and then once next year rolls around and the implementation begins, it'll be important to keep up that dialogue. So please follow us on social. Go to that webpage that we created, cba.ca.gov. Click right on the front right there. You see Assembly Bill 1175, and there's a lot of great information there, including a lot of background information for you to go down that rabbit hole, as we talked about. So thank you again, Denise, very much for joining us, and best of luck to all of your members. Thank you again, Dominic. And
thanks, David.
Thank you all for viewing and or listening to this episode of the Accounting for California podcast. Until next time, bye-bye.